Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. The light. It's had an interesting trajectory in Warcraft's lifetime, and I feel like talking about it and how it's been used. Specifically, how the concept of light zealotry has been used. Let's see if we can shed some light on it. In Warcraft's early days, probably through the RTS games, the light was basically a universally positive thing. They pretty much treated it as a fairly generic, in-universe religion that could be used in very overt, combat-oriented ways. The light guides you through life, but the light can also heal yourself and your allies, empower them, and be used to cut down evil foes. Though it came later, I think the librum that Uther wrote for Arthas titled The Light and How to Swing It is a comical but apt summary of how Blizzard were utilizing it. Anyway, we didn't fully know the limitations of the light. Obviously, it didn't make you invincible, at least for more than a dozen seconds, and obviously you couldn't smite every foe or truly resurrect someone, but whether that was down to the limits of the light itself or the users was unclear. Certainly, there was a degree of skill involved, as well as the matter of faith. Things got a little more complicated when we got to Vanilla WoW. This seems to be the first point in which the light was presented as not always being used for good. This was demonstrated most overtly with the Scarlet Crusade, which boasted a presence in the 4 short dungeons that comprised Scarlet Monastery, the Scarlet Graveyard, Library, Armory, and Cathedral. They were also present for half of the Stratholme dungeon that would be called Living by the players and later the Main Gate by Blizzard. And they also had a presence in Hearthglen in the Western Plaguelands and Tyr's Hand in the Eastern Plaguelands. The gist of their story was that they were organized during the Third War to fight back against the Scourge in Lordaeron, though they would treat the Forsaken as no different. Many of its would-be members played a part in purifying the Dark Crystal that would then be used to forge the Ashbringer. The Crusade's origins are a bit muddled, but it seems Abendis and Asilian were heavily involved early on, and that there was an air of racism towards non-human races. Despite this, they were relatively righteous in their goals, but this would soon change. 4 of the original 5 paladins in the Order of the Silver Hand were dead, missing, or exiled. The Dreadlord Balnazar covertly slew the 5th one, Seidan Dathrohan, and impersonated him to reform the Order into the Scarlet Crusade, driving the organization into Zealotry. This caused a schism, where members who felt the Crusade was straying from a noble path reorganized into the Argent Dawn. 2 particularly important members at this time were Renault Mograine, who Balnazar had manipulated into killing his father Alexandros Mograine with the Ashbringer, which then corrupted the blade, as well as Sally Whitemane, who would become the Crusade's most iconic member. The Scarlet Crusade we saw demonstrated to us that, whether or not the light itself was a purely benevolent force, it could at least be used by mortals for less than altruistic purposes. The Scarlets did do some good, of course, but with their fanaticism and racism should not really be considered good people. We could consider this our introduction to the concept of the light responding to faith and conviction more so than any purity of heart. Over time, we would come to learn more and more about the light. It became more of a tangible force in the narrative and less of an abstraction. I'm sure many are opposed to this demystification of the light, but I don't particularly mind it myself. We also increasingly saw that the light could be used forcibly, as with the Blood Knights who siphoned it off of the Naru Muuru, and that the light itself may not be good, but rather, let's call it neutral, with it being one of the 6 cosmic forces at play. At least in theory. In practice, it's still treated as very much a good thing 95% of the time. In contrast, the Void is still treated as very much a bad thing that can at best be used by good characters for good purposes. Now, rather than a comprehensive history of all light-based information we learn after Vanilla, I'm going to specifically target examples of light zealotry and fanaticism, Lux Volt and all that. Why, you might ask? Well, plainly, I think it's really cool. I mean, we're basically dealing with cultists here, and cults, in fiction, always appeal to me. I do loves me some good old-fashioned, void-oriented Lovecraftian cult activity, but on the other side of that coin, we have cult stuff that is less about giving in to the madness, and more convinced that it's being pure, pious, and righteous. In reality, of course, it is not. The juxtaposition is satisfying, and there's often an air of imperiousness that is less present with the darker stuff. At any rate, as long as there are members abdicating their free will, throwing away their old lives, and giving themselves over to the ecstasy of some greater power, I'm sold. Maybe that says a lot about me. Let's swing on over to Legion, where we have a fairly minor but very revelatory peek at how the light can be. Over the course of the X-Pack, we come across Light's Heart, the core component of the Prime Naru Zera. In patch 7.3, we meet up with Turalyon and the Army of the Light, a group of mostly Draenei who have mostly all had the light infused into their bodies and become Lightforged. Upon placing Light's Heart alongside her other pieces, we revive Zera, who immediately tries to non-con Illidan into a Lightforged himself. It doesn't go well for her, but given that Zera was the highest tier entity we'd been introduced that was cosmically aligned with the light, it was quite enlightening. The light could be aggressive. This was one of our first glimpses of what we would come to call the tyranny of the light. As I've said in the past, I love rejection of the gift and consider it one of the greatest moments in WoW history, so really, no complaints here. Prior to Legion, we were introduced to the character of Yrel, a wide-eyed young Draenei woman who would grow from a simple acolyte into a member of AU Draenor's Council of Exarchs. From everything we saw of her, she was a kind-hearted, giving, and understanding individual. So it was quite jarring when in the BFA Mag'har recruitment chain, we went back to Draenor, now sometime in the future, and discovered that she became quite the light fanatic herself, now holding the rank of High Exarch. She and her light-bound army went about attempting to convert the whole of Draenor to the light. Willingly, if possible, forcibly, if not. War broke out, and we take the last surviving Mag'har back with us to Azeroth. I was significantly less of a fan of this use of light zealotry. Aside from it basically throwing any potential future for AU Draenor into the toilet, it also seemed to run completely contrary to Yrel's character. Now, they could have absolutely spun a believable and satisfying series of events that drove Yrel to her extremist behavior. But they didn't. They pretty much threw her into the toilet as well. It felt horribly inorganic and honestly like a waste of the whole concept of cultish light worship. Don't do it this way, Blizz. Much more recently, in The War Within, we were introduced to the Halifal Arathi. It didn't take the player base long at all to start seeing potential light zealotry with them, but for the most part, they're actually pretty even-keeled. They do worship the sacred flame, which, as we understand it, is basically the light and fire fused together, and they highly revere Beledar, which exudes holy light the majority of the time. But perhaps due to the Arathi's dire situation in Halifal and necessarily militaristic structure, they seem to not have lost themselves to their zeal. Prioress Murprey and her followers in the Priory of the Sacred Flame, which really feels like Scarlet Monastery reimagined, may be an exception to this. However, many players, myself included, suspect that the Arathi Empire that they hail from may be far more extreme in their views. We know they have been separated from the rest of known Azeroth for at least a millennium, and that's more than enough time to get them good and radicalized. At the very least, we can hope that the current Arathi Emperor, Thoradin IX, fits the bill. Evidently, he and all of his predecessors have received visions from the sacred flame that they react to bring prosperity to their empire. Only time will tell how this is actually dealt with, but I for one would love a legitimate, light-aligned expansion big bad. The Emperor could give us that. And lastly, we return to the Scarlet Crusade, which I believe is simultaneously Warcraft's best and most mishandled example of a light cult. The origins of it felt logical, with its extreme beliefs forming quite naturally from the panic and trauma of the Scourge and the Plague of Undeath. Their views were flawed, but understandable, and they had fantastic drip. They were a great presence in vanilla. The problem is mostly everything that came after that. They returned in Wrath of the Lich King, where brand new Death Knight players completely ravaged them in New Avalon. Then Brigitte Abendis takes a sect of the Crusade to Northrend to combat the Lich King. But while there, they are infiltrated by yet another Dreadlord, this time Mal'Ganis, and ultimately accomplish nothing of importance. In Mists of Pandaria, the 4 Scarlet Dungeons are merged into 2, the Scarlet Halls, and Scarlet Monastery, with most of the bosses replaced with new analogs. Most importantly, Renault Mograine was replaced with Durand, as Renault had been slain by the spirit of his father years ago. A key exception to this wave of replacements, though, was High Inquisitor Whitemane, who it seems basically became the head of the organization. So great was her connection with the light that she could be repeatedly resurrected and only slain permanently with the Blades of the Anointed, which Lillian Boss would come to claim. And quite interestingly, especially in contrast to a more recent example of Kalia Menethil, when Whitemane was brought back, it doesn't seem that it was light necromancy. Whereas Kalia is essentially a light-forged undead, Whitemane does not appear to be undead at all, but still a human. So, I don't know, either they just revived her really quickly before her body could decompose at all, or she's just really, really in tune with the light. I mean, Darien Mograine does say that even the greatest of paladins cannot match the bond she has with it. And though death certainly mellowed her out, she still manages to maintain a connection with the light, using consecration and presumably other holy spells as well. The Scarlet Crusade then fell off the map until Dragonflight and the Forsaken Heritage quests, when remnants of the Crusade took Fenris Isle and launched an attack on the Forsaken. They were promptly shut down. That is, until the reclamation of Gilneas City, which evidently they had taken control of because Blizzard would rather us fight them than the Forsaken. I guess it at least makes sense that they would see Worgen as abominations. They were promptly shut down again. And in patch 11.1.7, Legacy of Erethdor, the Scarlet Crusade returned, yet again. This time as part of a coalition alongside the Syndicate and for some reason the Devious Brotherhood that called itself the Red Dawn and was led by Marin Trollbane. They were promptly shut down, yet again. If you haven't picked up on it, Blizzard's continual use of the Crusade to fill the role of generic bad guys that need to be defeated within 30 minutes of questing has done quite a number on its prestige. And maybe that's what they want, but it just feels kind of sad to me. How lame is it to take a once threatening enemy and then strip them down again and again for no real narrative payoff? A far more satisfying trajectory would have been the reverse. Have them start small, maybe just a few individuals espousing their beliefs, and have them increase in numbers and influence over the years until they become something that the players both fear and anticipate. Heck, that's what makes cults such a foreboding literary tool. They can grow eerily wide. They can harm you. They can assimilate you. I think they even had some real potential with Sally Whitemane. She was already a fan favorite character for certain reasons that I shall not vocalize at present. You know what they are. But the mop revamps introduced the concept of her being able to be resurrected infinitely because her conviction in the light was just that dang strong. Run with that. This lady won't stay dead? Maybe she's like that for a reason. Maybe she has something important to say. Maybe she's someone we should follow. Have the Crusade rally around their divine Empress of Light. Plus, how cool would it be to see her grow in power over WoW's life? From a leveling dungeon boss, to an endgame dungeon boss, to a raid end boss. And lastly, I feel the need to touch on Season of Discovery and the Scarlet Enclave, which seems to be, at least in some part, an answer to the fandom's relative love for this faction. It basically serves as a somewhat clunky continuation of the vanilla story that isn't meant to really change where Wrath picks it up. Basically, this guy named Calderan takes up the Ashbringer from Mograine and uses it to lead the Crusade for a time before we kill him and loot the Ashbringer, which eventually winds up in the hands of Darien Mograine. It's not the smoothest series of events, but the raid does give us a glimpse of Scarlet Crusade Lillian Boss, which is kind of neat. So, not the full extent of what I would have liked to have seen out of the Scarlets, but it's Season of Discovery. There's only so much they can do. I think that's everything. In summation, I'm a huge fan of light zealotry and cult stuff. I think it's an avenue for very fun to follow characters and narratives. I just feel like Blizzard has misused that card in some places while being too hesitant to fully explore it in others. I would have preferred the Scarlet Crusade to have been a more thorough and intimidating conduit for that design space, but hopefully Thoradin the Ninth and the Arathi Empire will be just as awesome. For this week's drawing, I of course had to go with the icon of light zealotry herself, Sally Whitemane, who I feel started out as a fairly minor character in the grand scheme of things, but gained more and more traction simply due to the popularity of her character and design. She was even used as an alternate priest hero in Hearthstone, and added as a playable character in Heroes of the Storm, where she basically plays as a disciplined priest using atonement healing. Back in the day, I had a lot of beef with this character. And that's because back in vanilla, when I was leveling my holy priest, her hat, Whitemane Chapeau, was the first headpiece item I was able to get my hands on. And the model for that hat, at least in WoW, is really frickin' ugly. But because I had gone 40 levels without any headpiece, I refused to hide it either. So I just kept running around on my troll with this ugly frickin' hat on my head until I was in my 50s. It was horrible, and it would basically take until Heroes of the Storm for me to forgive the character. And that's because prior to HOTS, she kind of didn't really have a personality, simply due to her not actually being a major character. But HOTS really delivered on the fantasy of her being this sadist that has fully given herself over to the rapturous beauty of the light. She's almost certainly crazy, but she wields legitimate power. I kinda dig that. And she's got one of the smuggest, haughtiest laughs in the game. I dig that too. Even her stupid hat was redesigned to look better, and she actually rocks it pretty well. And naturally, I drew her exactly where you fight her in Scarlet Monastery. So ultimately a character with a cool and unique design, with a ton of narrative potential that never really got realized, partially because her immense popularity was emergent and not something Blizzard had ever planned on. But that about does it for me. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye.